Good afternoon, everybody, and welcome to CDE Virtual. It's my great privilege to welcome Donald Kaberuka to join us this evening. Finance Minister in Rwanda, 1997 to 2003, then head of the African Development Bank for 2 terms, from 2005 to 2015, and in 2019, he was elected chair of the Global Fund to fight AIDS, TB, and malaria. Welcome to South Africa, Donald. It's great to have you.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Anne.
Let's start by talking about electricity. In an important article in 2018, you pointed out that the West African nation of Liberia, with a population around 4 million, had installed electricity of just 126 megawatts, about the average capacity of one of the more than 8,000 power plants in the United States. And then you went on to say that Liberians pay more than 3 times the average rate of electricity than Americans. So my first question to you is, why is it that poor people pay the most for electricity? What's going on here?
Right. Thank you. Thank you very much, Anne. I'm pleased to be with you and your audience. Yes, I recall that statement I made vis-a-vis Liberia. That was in 2007. And you recall that the previous decade, Liberia has gone through mayhem. Actually, they were paying at the time about 25 cents per kilowatt hour. To give you an idea, anything above 10 cents becomes immediately uneconomic and not socially sensitive. But to your bigger question, why do poor people pay so much? Actually, the majority of the people don't have any electricity at all. We have 800 million people in the world without access to electricity. And that depends on how you define access to electricity. If you mean a bulb, just a bulb, it is 800 million people. But if you mean electricity, which can drive a small machine, which can help a person do work in his garage, the numbers are close to 1.2 billion people in the world. So it is energy poverty, which is massive. Now, why isn't it poor people pay a lot when they have access to electricity? It's policy. And the way to explain it is, sometimes the energy could be available, but it's not accessible to poor people because it's expensive. So there's availability, and then there is access. But there is also the whole question of affordability and how different governments handle it. Far too often, it is by a very inefficient system of untargeted subsidies, which means that the national companies who are responsible for power, their balance sheet becomes weaker and weaker year after year. And so they cannot invest upstream in new energy. It's a very curious situation. You set out to help, but use the wrong instrument, which is untargeted subsidies, which benefit many of those who consume more. But the poor actually end up disadvantaged by lack of access, but also by lack of investment. So it's around policy on access and affordability. And finally, there's another big issue, which is many poor people actually, when they're dependent on on-grid electricity, all right? Actually, the country could be having a high level of installed electricity, but it's not available to them. They see transmission lines passing over them. We have seen that as well. So it is a whole difficult around policy on access and affordability, which makes poor people, when they have a little of electricity, pay more. But in the scheme of things, if governments could figure out how to have targeted subsidies to people who need them, and these are targeted effectively, it could work actually very, very well.
So moving deeper into electricity issues, you've said that the biggest impediment to economic growth on this continent is energy. You also said in 2015, and I quote you, that it's hypocritical for Western governments who have funded their industrialization using fossil fuels to say to African countries, no, you can't develop dams, you can't develop coal, you must rely on what you saw as expensive renewables. Is that still your view? How do you see these issues, so the West and Africa and energy?
And let me answer the question differently so that I'm not misunderstood. We totally understand that the energy transition away from fossil fuels is the way to go. We also understand that Africa has plenty of those, plenty of renewables. Just look at the Inga Dam alone and many more possibilities in the Congo Basin, the Ethiopian highlands, the mountains of Lesotho, Mozambique, all over the place. So we have plenty of renewables. The problem is capital to develop those renewables. So we're talking about, yes, decarbonize the economies, we agree, but let us have a just transition, all right? Just in the sense that in the mix, fossil fuels like gas will still have a role to play for some time, not just in Africa, but also just transition in the sense that it is funded by those who have actually contributed to global warming. It's an argument which may be circuitous, but it is just that Africa has plenty of renewables. We can develop them. Maybe not every country has renewables, but we can create energy markets, sell, buy from each other. But you know, to do 1 megawatt of electricity from hydro, when the terrain is not complicated, you're talking about $1 million, just 1 mega. So it's quite a lot of money. But luckily, thank God, the cost of some renewables is coming down, like solar, like battery technology. So there are opportunities there. But for evidence sake, all we're saying is, for Africa to transform and industrialize, we need to fight energy poverty, the one I was just referring to. And second, we need to have that just transition, which recognizes the mix will have a lot of things depending upon what every country or region have. And also we need a mechanism of funding so that Africa can develop its renewables, for which it has plenty. That is all I said. I never use those binary choices, which often are false choices. It is fossil fuels or it is renewables. No, it is funding. It is a just transition. It is energy poverty, all right? And I think in the conversation we have, we needed to put a lot of focus on that.
Great, that's clear. So let me take up this phrase of a just transition, which sounds, I agree with. Do you really believe, and this is, you're no longer representing the continent as such, so I can ask you this question. Do you really believe that wealthy countries are going to help poorer countries deal with their transition towards a green economy or deal with the consequences of climate change? They say they will, but do you believe that they will in a significant way? You know, not just a little bit of money or money that sounds like a grant but turns out to be a loan. Is this really going to happen?
And it's not what I believe it. It is, again, what is just. And by the way, are they helping us or are they helping themselves? We didn't have to go back to the basics. This is a global public good, all right? If it's a global public good, no one is helping anyone else, all right? We're only saying that to keep this planet livable, okay, either from a mitigation side or adaptation side, we have to mobilize resources globally to fund those issues. I was in a group set up after the Copenhagen summit, which was chaired by the former Prime Minister of Ethiopia, Meles Zenawi, and the former Prime Minister of Norway, I think now he's the head of NATO. And we were charged with a reflection on how we can raise the famous $100 billion per year to help low-income countries fund what we're discussing. We put a lot of proposals on the table. All of them, in my assessment, quite sensible, quite reasonable, quite doable. And they were not involving any rich country helping, as we put it, poor countries. It was all of us helping ourselves. It has not happened, as it did not happen during coronavirus, okay? But there's a real politics. But it is not about rich countries helping poor countries. Yes. It's about how does the world fund global public goods, of which climate is one of the biggest.
I'll take that point. Do you think it's going to happen?
Now, I think the question is not what I want to happen. It is what we, as citizens of this planet, have to do collectively to make this planet livable. It's a choice we have to make, all of us. Now, will it happen? We have to keep fighting. We have to keep fighting for it to happen. Both those you call global north and the global south. It is not just, by the way, climate change, it's about pandemics, all right? You remember the famous phrase in the pandemics, nobody is safe until all of us are safe. And suddenly vaccines and therapeutics were only available to one part of the world. So that is the real politics. That's how the world operates. But it is not the way it should operate for us to deal with these global commons.
Okay, well, my last question on electricity. You once asked an important question, which went like this. When we help the continent build its future energy systems, are we planning for poverty or for economic transformation of this continent? What do you mean?
So I go back to the point I made earlier. You remember, please don't misunderstand me. I was not a particular admirer of Vladimir Lenin, but he's on record as having said that communism was socialism plus electricity. He said to have said that. Well, now, whether it was true or not, a point very important was being made. It's not about people in low-income countries or in Africa just getting a bulb from some off-grid solar somewhere. They need that. But we need energy for economic transformation. No country in the world, no region in the world has ever transformed its economy unless they have access to energy at reasonable cost. I'll give you the example of Vietnam, which I was giving this morning. Vietnam had a GDP of $14 billion in 1992. Now Vietnam has a GDP of just under $500 billion, from 14 to $500 billion, even GDP per capita has gone up to around 4,000. Okay, population has increased from 67 million to around 100 million people. Now, there are many factors to this, which people have different views, but two factors were critical. One was the human capital formation. They did invest in education. Second was cost of electricity. They had reasonably good price of electricity, I think 6 cents per kilowatt hour. And combined with other factors, they were able to attract a lot of FDI, especially from South Korea. I don't know if you know that, I think about 40% of some of the products of Samsung are not made in South Korea. They're made in Vietnam. So these are kind of transformation I'm referring to because they are possible. From $14 billion to $500 billion in 30 years, that is transformation, especially when it is accompanied by massive improvement in human indicators. I was in Vietnam a month ago. They have reduced malaria incidence and malaria mortality by 75%. Wow. So the economy has not simply expanded. They have also reached the impacted human development indicators. So the point I was making, maybe in a clumsy way, was we don't simply need bulbs. We need power to transform our economies by creating jobs and opportunities.
Very important. Let me turn then to infrastructure. So when you were head of the African Development Bank, you emphasized the importance of building and financing infrastructure for the continent's development. And who could disagree with that? So the question is, in your experience, who is the most important, or who are the most important financial institutions in getting infrastructure up and running in Africa over the past 10 years or so? Has it been China? Has it been African countries themselves, other countries from other parts of the world, private companies, mainly from the West, the World Bank, the BRICS Bank, or the African Development Bank? Who've been the major players here? How should we think about this?
So, and there will be issues around attribution and contribution. We can discuss this. And I'm not here to distribute grades as who did more than others, but I'm making a more general point about the importance of infrastructure in a balkanized continent. Because remember in 1963, at the creation of the Organization of African Unity, a decision was taken that these borders don't make sense, all right? Absolutely, they don't make sense from the Sahel to all parts of Africa. But you have to make them less important by economic integration. And that begins by laying down the necessary infrastructure, whether it is digital, rails, airports, and all this. I'm not saying that hard infrastructure alone will do it, but it is a beginning to removing other forms of barriers to expand our economic opportunities and attract investment. And so it was only right that we give emphasis to infrastructure, both hard and soft. Now, who has done more? My answer actually would surprise you. I think it is the countries themselves who have done a lot more. People often don't know this. And then others have contributed in different ways, depending upon those who have the pockets. I am sometimes surprised at how China is misunderstood in this conversation, all right? Because I think China, like the World Bank, like African Development Bank, depending upon the instruments they have contributed enormously, whether it is dams, airports, rail. You just have to go across Africa. I think finger pointing to China has not been very helpful. I think what would have been helpful would have been an intelligent conversation around how do we combine private funding, concessional funding, concessional to the risk private capital, use different instruments to make sure that we have got long-term capital, because infrastructure to give you a return takes quite some time. So what we need is long-term capital. So I think countries themselves, China, the DFIs, there have been a lot of PPPs, although those are quite problematic sometimes, as each party tries to shift risk to the other party. And then there have also been quite an interesting development, especially in the space of digital and fibers, fiber optics, where the private sector has played a very big role. There is a firm, which you and I know very well, which has literally laid optic fibers across Africa. Now they're doing the same across the oceans. And when you combine that with data centers, all right, these are the kind of things I think we need. And it doesn't matter who does it, as long as it is done in a way which perhaps does not generate excessive debt, which does not create mismatch, whether it is asset liability mismatch or currency mismatches, and enables us to use this infrastructure intelligently by removing other barriers as well. That is the point I was making.
Yeah, that's interesting. So let me just push a bit harder on this. There's a lot of talk about the one-sidedness of Chinese infrastructure or Chinese funded infrastructure in Africa or Sri Lanka or other places. Just tell us a bit more. You might have answered this, but just tell us your view on your experience on that issue. I know the bank under you sort of set up a mechanism of discussing, what would be the right approach to dealing with these kinds of issues. How do you see it? That's more focused.
Again, I'm not trying to go into this finger pointing fairly sterile exercise. I'm more interested in how to attract finance into closing Africa's infrastructure gap, which is $98 billion per annum. How best do we do that without creating the mismatches which I've just mentioned on currency and asset and liabilities? That is the bigger question. So you'll be pleased to hear, maybe, before I left the FDB, we had actually created with the People's Bank of China, they have an outfit called SAFE, which manages the reserves, a facility combined with African Development Bank to do infrastructure in Africa. So we are using a bit of Chinese reserves to giving them a return, of course, to do infrastructure in Africa. And also, we try to do that with Africa's own institutions. There's an outfit in Casablanca called the Africa 50 Infra, which we set up with two aims: to de-risk infrastructure project, to attract capital, but also to do some of the risky, more complex things. And I would like to see more and more of those kind of initiatives. That said, I really should add here that I've been distressed by sometimes infrastructures which have been put up at a very, very high cost, which in a few years you find they're debilitated, they're no longer functional because of lack of maintenance. It is very, very important that a lot of those investments, which take a long time to yield a return, are looked after because they come at high cost. Not in all countries, but I've seen some areas where it can be quite distressing. Equally, I've seen places where you have cross-border infrastructure. It is there. But you find that because of other barriers, non-tariff barriers, traffic is actually not moving as well as it could. So there are a lot of things to be done there, both on the financing and on non-tariff restrictions. I just end by giving an example of aviation. You see, building an airport is one thing, but actually getting African airlines, okay, to use them, using all the 5 degrees of freedom, all right, which is encapsulated in something called the Yamoussoukro Agreement, would reduce the cost of aviation on the continent by 40%. But it is not happening. So as a result, our business people still pay a high price for those unnecessary restrictions, not because of lack of infrastructure. Airports are there, all right? It's because of policy.
Right. Let's turn now to the bank you led for 10 years, the African Development Bank. What does that bank do that a commercial bank can't do? Say Standard Bank or some big South African bank. What's the difference? How should we think about it, in your view?
So, Anne, I think, okay, first of all, I tell you that I don't like the binary. It is this or that. Maybe the issue is, how can you mobilize all forms of finance to resolve a particular problem? But if you ask me a straight question of what does a development bank do, which a commercial bank cannot do, I would just classify them about probably 4. Number 1 is long-term finance, obviously. Number 2 is risk stuff, which commercial banks obviously will not take up, or if they do, interest rate to be punitive. And the third will be complex. There's some which are very complex, okay? And the last, which actually is less known, is what we discovered during the global financial crisis. The ability of these institutions to be counter-cyclical during a financial crisis. Because during that financial crisis, we found that because of liquidity issues in the world, many other problems, trade finance had literally dried up. And so development banks, whose mission is not to do short-term trade finance, we stepped in and provided counter-cyclical financing. So I would say long-term finance for risky stuff, complex, then counter-cyclicality. Increasingly though, and this is a debate in the reform of the international financial architecture, I think these institutions will have to move more into the area of what is known now as de-risking, which I'd like to explain this way. Because of the demographics in the world, the global north every year has got more and more glut of savings. In a place like Japan, even if you put interest at -3, you not increase consumption investment because of demographics. The same for South Korea and the many other countries in the global economic north. And so they're getting a small return for their pension funds, institutional investments, when actually they could get a better return in the south, where the problem is the opposite. Demographics are in their favor, but they don't have access to capital, which they need to develop opportunities. What has been missing is an intermediation vehicle in between these two problems. Because those with savings feel that the many in the global south are risky. Not always true, but it's what they feel. So institutions which can provide that de-risking of that intermediation, I think would be the biggest mission for these international institutions going forward, other than, of course, financing the global public goods.
It's very interesting. So in your 10 years, what are the big achievements in your view that the bank sort of, what did you do that was really that you're proudest of in that period that you can tell us? I think most South Africans are like me. We don't know much about the African Development Bank. So I'm asking very basic questions.
And yet, when I was at the African Development Bank, South Africa became the third largest shareholder of the institution.
Right.
And the links with the countries are quite strong. But if you're asking me what I'm proud of, what I did well, I leave this to others. I'm not about to give myself grades. It's a long time ago I left the FDB. It will be up to others to decide. I want to concentrate more on things I would have liked to do a bit more. I begin with the ones I've just mentioned, around de-risking.
Right.
I wish we could have done more on the de-risking side, but the shareholders, those institutions tend to be risk averse. I wish I could have done a lot of that. I also wish I could have done a lot more in these countries which are wrongly called fragile states, because some of them are quite large, quite significant. I refer, for example, to the region of the Sahel, 100 million people, which have gone to a secular, cyclical crisis, which means that things done 10 years ago, you have to go back every 10, 20 years. We tried some initiatives there of dealing with fragility. I think that agenda is still very, very important, not because of the fact that millions of people are trapped in those countries, but because of the neighborhood effects as well. What happens there affects the neighborhood and affects the perception of investment and increases the risk premium. So those two we had started, which had done a bit more. Of course, we tried very hard on infrastructure, 65% of all our portfolio. But as to what I'm proud of, what I did well, I leave this for others to say honestly. I turned the page.
Okay. But I assume the bank grew during your tenure in its reach and its influence. Would that be fair to say, or wrong question?
But it is true because it coincided with a period in Africa, at the turn of the millennium, whether the continent was entering a period of reversing a 30-year decline in real per capita incomes. Because you recall, between 1980 and 2000, Africa was getting poor. Not all countries, because of civil wars, because of disease burden. You remember Liberia, Sierra Leone, genocide in my own country. You remember the crisis in Angola. You remember the wars in different places. Okay? And especially HIV/AIDS. And so the debt crisis and the macroeconomic issue and the neglect because of the end of the Cold War. And so it had created a situation whereby by 2000, for the first time, Africa began a journey of what we call converging with the rest of the world, when real per capita incomes were positive. And I thought it was important to accompany that process. And so we tried to expand the reach of the bank precisely because that was the time when that was needed. It has continued since. I think that is very good. But it's very important to understand, and even if the bank grew 20 times, or even the World Bank grew 10 times, that's not where the capital for transformation will come from. Capital will come from the private markets. Yeah. This will go back to the issue of de-risking, because the capital is there, it's looking for a return, but we need institutions to de-risk. It's not a closed envelope from the World Bank or FDB, which is handed over to a country, a project here which we need. We need something qualitatively different, and this is what we have been discussing.
What is your view of the BRICS Bank? How significant is it now? How big do you think it can get? How do you think about this?
My guess, at least from the little I knew at the time, it was still the beginning. I think they were working on their business model. It was still reasonably small bank, because I think total capital was about $100 billion, which is reasonably small, because they were still working out their modalities. I think you have to look at together with the Asia Infrastructure Bank, which was created by China. Those two were really an important addition to the architecture of Bretton Woods. And I'm hoping they continue to grow so that they complement, they fill gaps left by the architecture of institutions created in 1945.
Right. Is there a chance that the African Development Bank becomes a junior partner to BRICS on the continent, or that's far away?
No. The African Development Bank is still much bigger than that bank, because obviously it's an older institution. It has much more experience, a lot more capacity, highly skilled people. But I think the issue is not about who is senior, who is junior. I go back to the issue of complementarity. I go to the issue of how we leverage every force we can find in the world to attract capital in the continent. So if the FDB could work with the BRICS Bank and the Asian Infrastructure Bank to attract those kind of investments in Africa, for me, that would be a lot more interesting than who is doing more, who is doing less. It's a whole ecosystem. I think in the international financial architecture, is trying to see how you work as an ecosystem, not as a league of who is doing what more than the other.
Okay. Can I ask you, you got a lot of experience of multilateral organizations. What is your view on BRICS? And what do you think it is really? And what could it be, or what should it be? But what is it?
You know, I think that I go back to the turn of the millennium, when most of the growth which was driving the global economy was coming from some of these large countries in the global south, the like of China, India, Brazil, and so on. Those were the ones actually pulling up the global growth. But there is now, I think, India, Indonesia, to an extent, China are likely to do. And so it is natural that those countries who have been the engines in recent economic growth seek to set up their own organization or system. I think there's too much talk nowadays about something called multipolarity. It's quite a popular word. I think that how many are they? 4, 5, 10? I don't know. I think the case is that there'll be a lot of what some of my colleagues, including the former president of the World Bank, Bob Zolik, a friend of mine, called the fragmentation. We're likely to see more fragmentation in different compositions, whether it is from the global north or the emerging markets and so on. So me, I see the BRICS as part of that reflection, the reconfiguration of different economic blocks to reflect the realities of today.
Let's turn now to an area I know a bit more about, democracy and development. What is your view on the relationship between democracy and development? Big question.
Yeah, what I don't like about that, often it is presented as a chicken and egg. It's a chicken and egg. And as a result, the conversation is not very productive. Both democracy and development, as Mele Sena used to say, are good objectives in themselves. Okay. Number two, no country can say it is fully developed. Or no country can say, here's my democratic model, let the rest of the world adopt it. Sometimes even with missionary zeal. All countries in the world are still working on their development trajectory, on their democratic trajectory. They look different. They're not always the same. But for me, at the heart of it is another question, not this chicken and egg. It is, how do we actually deliver service to the people? Because any system which does not deliver health, education, all right, and our other public goods, really runs the system lack credibility. Doesn't matter what you call it. So this ability to deliver education, services, infrastructure, ability to be accountable, and ability to govern for all, not for some. For me, these are the three fundamental issues so important. And governing for all, being accountable, and deliver service to the people, for me, is much more critical than all these fairly, as I say, chicken and egg conversation about democracy and development. But I realize these are my personal views and the other views are there. But this is what I'm putting to you.
How's this worked out in many African countries? Are there places where you've been surprised at how they've met those three criteria you set up for us? Or you've been disappointed? How you know the continent so well? Are there examples where you feel, gee, this worked out well and it's altered my view a bit? Are there any examples you can tell us?
You know, and development is not something you go on a shelf and pick it up and dust it and you copy it. It doesn't work like that. All countries on planet Earth have gone it their own way. You just have to look at the composition of G20, right? They have all become economic superpowers, but they have come to it from different directions, all right? Depending upon the historical circumstances. Now, just look at the case of Indonesia and India, all right? Two countries, same, but slightly different. India now would be the biggest demography in the world, all right? But India is one country, not like us, 54, 55 countries. Indonesia is 40% of Asia's landmass, all right? Between those two countries, a lot of things happen, but they are not the same. And I really want to urge you to think through in terms of basics, but what does it mean for the people? What does it mean for the people in terms of health, education, opportunities? Are they governed fairly? Are the governors governing for all? Are they accountable? Those are things which, for me, are much more important than to try to compare models of democracy. Look, from the Confucian values, Judeo-Christian values, from other values, there are all kinds of things one have to bear in mind. And each time I've entered this debate of development of democracy and chicken and egg, I have not found it productive.
I suppose for me, I see a big battle of ideas, big ones, but also smaller ones with implications, a big battle of ideas across the continent, our continent, between a democratic approach to government and a more autocratic one. And so this, I think, for me, it's a big issue, but you seem to be saying this is something the big words hide more than they reveal, if I'm correct in understanding you. So I think there is a kind
I'm only saying to you,
of models, yeah.
And I'm only saying to you that just look at what is happening in the global north in recent years.
Yes.
Okay. Even people in the global north asking themselves, is governance working for them? What is it? All right. So these are issues we have to be extremely careful before we become prescriptive or pull out some normative land of how things should be done. The big challenge in Africa, and it's not that at the moment, it's not these debates which are often driven from outside. It is about what is the nature of government and what is it doing? What is it delivering? When you go to a country, you find the educational system is falling apart, right? When you find the healthcare system is falling apart, infrastructure is dilapidating, you really wonder about what is going on. Or you find that governance structures favor one part of the country, not another, or some communities, not others. For me, those are things which are so vital important for us to get right, especially because of this famous demographic dividend, i.e. the young people are waiting for those things. And as you know, you and I, the demographic dividend lasts for only about 40 years until we're gone. And we shall be still arguing about Western neoliberal democracy or some other Confucian models. No, I think we need to focus on the essentials. And if we do that, I think we'll find over time our ways of doing things, our democratic structures, our governance structures, which may not resemble Denmark or Sweden or the US. But I've seen some friends in the US also questioning their own democracy, how it is working. But this is a debate for another day. I'll leave it to you.
Okay, I'm going to back off on some of this, but let me ask one question here. I was going to ask about Chinese influence, but I think we've discussed that. There are a lot of people wandering around Washington that I've encountered who say Americans are losing out in Africa, that they're somehow being left behind. And I'm never clear if they're talking about the government or private companies. How do you see that? How do you respond to that issue?
First of all, I very much dislike the idea that Africa is some kind of football pitch where people come to compete. No, not at all. It's not a place where Americans and Chinese or Europeans come to compete in their own interests. Not at all. That has happened in the past because of our own weaknesses, the weakness of our states. But increasingly, Africans are mature enough to know their interests and how best to define them vis-a-vis any partner, whether it is the Americans or the Chinese. Now, I can't speak for the Americans, I can't speak for the Chinese. Right? I can only speak for the Africans when I was still in office. And what we need to do is to better define our interests, better defend them in the negotiations, better articulate them, and improve them over time. If we do that, all partners are welcome. And I'll just give you an example, which I have no problem saying it to you. When I was in office, we had this system called international competitive bidding for large contracts, say of infrastructure. Now, international competitive bidding gives you the best quality and hopefully the best price. But it's true that Chinese companies, very good Chinese companies, contrary to what he said, were actually every year winning more and more contracts. It went from about 20% to close to 60%. And so the European Union at the time decided, okay, no, our taxpayers will not accept the fact that we hand over money and it goes to Chinese companies. I thought this was extremely short-sighted, very short-sighted, because then they left this particular sector. But they could have reasoned differently. why don't we work together in a triangular relationship, all right, to build infrastructure in Africa, reduce the cost of business, increase opportunities for us all, including Europeans, all right? But because of this short-term calculus, all right, they left. So if you look at the EU portfolio, especially in cross-border infrastructure, it diminished dramatically between 2000 and about 2015, I think. And they would admit the reason I've just told you. So I think if Africans know their interests, define them well, articulate them, all partners are welcome, all right? And whether they're traditional or new partners, I think for me, that's what is important.
Right, right. Let's turn to something that you care about a lot, trade between the 54 African countries. I know you've said many times how important this is for growth. So has there been real progress made in getting rid of the barriers to trade between African countries? And how optimistic are you about the African Continental Free Trade Agreement?
Okay, so let me ask you a question. If the US, the mighty US and Canada and Mexico, okay, thought a free trade area is something they have to do and develop, if Asian countries feel the same, while 54 Balkanized countries, would they act differently in their own interest? But here I should add just something not known to many people. Actually, a free trade agreement is not a very high level of integration. It's a second level from the law. You begin with a preferential tariff area. You reduce tariffs among members, you don't eliminate them. You have a free trade area where you eliminate the tariffs among members, but you still don't have a common external tariff. You only get to that once you have a customs union. And you move on to a common market. And if you are lucky, one day, a common currency, all right? There are actually areas of Africa who have a common currency already, one central bank, harmonized standards, all right? So technically speaking, you could call them actually a single market. They moved even a common market to a single market because there are free movement of capital, of goods, of services, and the rights of installation. So different parts of Africa have actually moved to higher levels of integration. The problem is actually bring all of that together, what is known as the spaghetti ball. And number two, the non-tariff restrictions. I think we're wasting too much time in terms of rules of origin, dispute resolution, anti-dumping legislation. What are the tariff offerings? When we already have actually low-hanging fruits, okay, building on the existing communities, which we can do already. I think if we do that, we could move much faster than people think. Yeah, but I think we're stuck in this calculus of zero sum, okay? I don't think it is possible when countries come together that all of them gain at the same time. You know, it doesn't work like that. And so there have to be mechanisms in there to deal with those kind of intertemporal different movement along the axis. But I'm confident that if we grab the low-hanging fruits, that if we work harder on the non-tariff restrictions, on the movement of bona fide persons, I'm saying bona fide persons, implement things we have said to implement, and strengthen the African Union, because it is a vehicle we need for this CFTA to succeed.
Sorry, just clarify for me what you mean by bona fide people. I'm not sure I'm clear.
Okay, so when you say free movement of people, some countries feel that there'll be too many migrants who don't have the credentials, who don't have the reason to do so. Okay, so every country, of course, deals with that differently. All right, I'm talking about bona fide. I'm talking about business people, students, tourists, people who are coming to do business or to visit. Okay, but they are not criminals. They are not involved in some underhand activities. This is what I call bona fide. It is easier to begin that way, pending the day when it is completely free.
Okay, that's clear. Thank you. We're starting to run out of time, and I want to talk about two other things. The first is about your home country. This has been a remarkable, out of tragedy, a remarkable story. How would you describe it to us, the achievements of Rwanda and also its trajectory? How do you see this?
So think of 1994, and I don't know where you were.
Voting in South Africa.
Exactly. South Africa has gone through transition. Nobody gave Rwanda a chance in 1994. Nobody gave Rwanda a chance. It was the biggest tragedy in African history. Okay, so what has happened? What has happened, which I think is a lesson to every other African country, that no matter how bad the initial conditions are, no matter how bad conditions are, under certain conditions, you can actually do great things. And the way the leadership in Rwanda has gone about it is to think like this. Okay, we're a small economy. We are not as big as some of the giants, but we shall think big. Because you can be a big country and think small. Or you can be a small country and think big, and therefore increase your carrying capacity. Look at the Netherlands. The Netherlands is a very small country, but its carrying capacity is very, very high. They sometimes even reclaim the sea. But it is a country which thinks big. That has been number one, important for Rwanda. And I think it's relevant for many, many countries on the continent. Just stop thinking small. Think, raise the ambitions for your people. Number two, the issue I mentioned about governing for all, governing fairly for all, is very important. Because in many countries in Africa today, you find electoral cycles where basically it is a fight to the death. And so the winner takes all. Once the winner takes all, then you're back to square one. And I think our ability to have ambitions, govern for all, be accountable, is what creates a basis to overcome all of the challenges which might have. I do believe that whether it is these countries who have gone through mayhem, there cannot have been bigger mayhem than what happened in my country in 1994, all right? We can actually make it if we do the things I've just mentioned and many more, and if we work together in the context of the Continental Free Trade Area. But there are many other lessons. We don't have time to go through them today. But I would say those three for me are key.
Very interesting. I think that's what Rwanda's done with remarkable success, from what I know. Are there what's the trajectory for the next 10 to 20 years? Anything you're worried about on the horizon? So
I think there is a plan. So Rwanda had a plan which was called 2020. It's remarkable how many of the objectives have been achieved. They are visible to the naked eye, except if you don't see them, whether it's education, health, infrastructure, and the rest of it. Now the challenge for Rwanda, like other African countries, is to go to the next level, where you attain middle-income country status. And that will be large around development of human capital. This is what I was saying this morning at the World Bank meeting. When you compare to similar countries in the past, it's sorted around like four things. Human capital, it's around stability, it's about accountability, and it's about this idea of making your country attractive to FDI. I just mentioned Vietnam. I mean, just imagine how you can attract the FDI in a small country like Vietnam, all right? Yeah. And multiply your GDP 40 times. Yeah. But from what I could see, I think ability to reap the demographic dividend, which is where really the big issues are, is a challenge for many African countries who are in the same category as my own. And all the investment you can put in people, all right? Stable countries, improving our infrastructure, I think Africa can go places. There's a lot of pessimism about Africa, which I think often is misplaced based on some stereotypes and which are built over years.
I agree with you. So my last question is about Africa and the rest of the world. You once said that Africa has accepted junior partnership with the West on global engagements. Whenever there is a discussion on any topic, whether on climate or migration, we accepted a degree of junior partnership. Those were your words. And interestingly, one of South Africa's leading papers on the weekend, the editor said in very different words, he was saying the same thing. What do you mean by that? And how do you change this if Africa is asking for aid?
So you missed the one word I said, though. I said Africa has implicitly accepted junior partnership. I didn't say it as accepted.
Okay.
Said implicitly. The difference is important.
Blame your editor, not me.
It's important. So I was referring to the fact that aid itself is not the problem. Look, after World War II, Europe needed aid to reconstruct its devastated economy. Japan needed aid to reconstruct its economy. The World Bank, the first loan to Japan was to build some infrastructure. All right. So that's not the problem. The problem is how over time, trade and investment balances out those relationships. But I was referring to the fact that there's a relationship between the global North and the global South, which has a degree of paternalism and a degree of, if you forgive my word, some relic of neocolonial links. All right, we need to do things for Africa. So call a big conference somewhere in Europe. We're going to do great things for Africa. Of course, you end up doing not very much. Okay, and we go to those meetings, and I think that the Africa Continental Free Trade Area, one of its strengths was it was providing an answer to that. All right, it was providing an answer to that. We have solutions here. All right, and if we build on that foundation, we'll be a partner like any other part of the world. Look, I was giving an example this morning. Again, forgive me, talk about ASEAN because I was there a month ago. You remember the Vietnamese boat people running away from Vietnam in rocket boats trying to get to Australia? That was started in the early 80s. Very much like what you see in the Mediterranean.
Wow.
All right. And the ASEAN region was being described in those terms. Okay. But they have done things which I've just described to you. The free trade area there seems to be working very, very well. Not simply Vietnam, even the small countries around it, Cambodia, Laos, Thailand, Malaysia, all of them. And that is the force of the CFT. And I think you asked me what the solution. The solution is the CFT.
Great. This is a very good note on which to end. I couldn't agree more with you about the importance of growth and countries getting on with it. And that's how you find your place in the world. So Donald Kaberuka, thank you so much for your time. It's been absolutely fascinating. I hope the audience has found it as interesting as I did. And I think you will have seen from this hour why I was so keen to interview Donald tonight. Thank you very much for joining us and good evening.
Thank you, Anne. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you. A terrific interview. Thank you very much.